Hello, everyone, and welcome in this EU DisinfoLab webinar. My name is Alexandre. I work at EU DisinfoLab. Today, we're going to talk about measuring the risk and impact of disinformation and open the discussion. And I'm very happy to have here two experts of the issue, which have both developed very interesting tools to discuss about how to measure impact. Impact is a very complicated question for many researchers, journalists, and fact checkers, or industry representatives working on disinformation and influence operations, because it's always a question about what's the overall success of an information operation. When can I decide, when do I decide to fact check a hoax that I observe? When do I take the right decision to report on this? These are real impactful question that as practitioners we ask ourselves every day. So I have the immense pleasure to welcome Ben Nimmo, who works was global lead of threat intelligence at Meta, but has many lives into researching, investing in investigating influence operations. So Ben, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And I'm also with Raquel Miguel Serrano, who is a researcher in EU DisinfoLab, who wrote numerous papers about disinformation in Germany or in Spain for EU DisinfoLab, and has been working on this. Before we kick off a bit this session, so which will last 1 hour, a few housekeeping rules. So we are here to discuss the risk and impact of disinformation. So we'll really focus on this topic, and I will insist on directing your questions only on this topic, because that's where we will focus on today. And I'm pretty sure you will have many questions. So if you have questions, I can only ask you to go on slido.com and to type the code that you can see now on your screen, 9593. 696, or to use a QR code that is here. And using this, you will be able to, we have a few questions for you. We're going to start with very simple ones, like, how are you feeling today? I'm waiting for you to start answering this question before we start the webinar. It's a win-win solution here. So please start responding to the question while I'm introducing a bit the webinar. So Ben, you worked 2 years ago. We just made a joke about that. 2 years ago, almost today, you've been releasing the Breakout Scale. The Breakout Scale is really an index on how to measure the success of an influence operation, and we're going to get into what does it mean, what does it say, and what is it bringing as new questions about how to measure, when to report, and what kind of vulnerabilities we have in our societies, and what can we do about that. But before getting into an impact of an operation, we're going to talk about the risk about single pieces of content. And Raquel, you've been working and inspired by Ben's work. You've been working on a very interesting index that was published on the DisinfoLab website a few months ago, which is really trying to look at different scales and different indicators that anybody can rate to measure how a single piece of content of disinformation or a hoax can be assessed, and to a bit evaluate the risk the disinformation can take, and when is the right time to report on it, or how is the right time to assess one piece. So I can see that everybody's feeling great, so which is good. It's almost good weather here in Brussels, so I'm going to directly give the floor to Raquel for the first part of this. Raquel, the floor is yours for 12 to 13 minutes.
Thank you, Alex, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you again for attending this webinar. Even if this ends up being repetitive during the session today, I'd like to insist on the relevance and complexity of studying the real risks of mis and disinformation. At EU DisinfoLab, we made an attempt with our impact risk index that I will be presenting today. And I will start with some context surrounding the creation of the index. As some in the audience may already know, we, the researchers at EU DisinfoLab, monitor hoaxes and debunks. But when trying to analyze in depth, when we try to infer the disinformative trends for our reports, we cannot give the same relevance or the same attention to every hoax, narrative, or disinformative discourse we encounter, because this content can merely be an isolated post, it can become a viral narrative, or even in the worst case, it can have a dangerous impact in the offline world. In trying to resolve this issue, we looked towards the Breakout Scale created by Ben Nimmo that was designed to measure the impact of disinformative influence operations. But a logistical issue emerged. It was first a problem of time. We couldn't apply it hoax by hoax. And also it was difficult to apply it in some occasions because influence operations are not the same as hoaxes or single pieces of disinformation. Hoaxes function differently and are not always based on social network content. Summing up, the scale was fantastic, but we needed a streamlined alternative. That led us to create something that researchers could use in their daily work. The aim was to analyze single pieces of disinformation, hoax by hoax, and rapidly identify those falsities that potentially carry bigger risks or may lead to more articulated campaigns, such as influence operations. Without further ado, let's have a look at our index. Next slide, please. Yeah. If we start from the premise that it's very difficult to measure the risk of impact, we have to look for indicators that can give us hints. Our method goes through a list of 8 indicators related to the virality and engagement of a single piece of disinformative content, whose scores will be translated into a final index, placing it in low, medium, high, or alarming impact risks. In total, we have 10 points to allocate, with 3 extra points if there is a call to action in the narrative. I will explain it. Next slide, please. So our first indicator is the engagement on social networks. We will measure shares and reactions to the content because they really imply that there has been an user's active engagement, meaning an active role, a real interaction with the content. We will leave comments out of this category. I can explain later why. And for simplicity, we will consider here just the social media platform where the single piece of disinformation collected the highest number of shares and reactions, regardless of its appearance in more than one platform. That is something that will be considered at a later stage. We give 3 points maximum according to the numbers you can see in the slides. I have to say that these numbers were designed according to our needs. We took the size of the audience of the country we are researching as a reference, but you can adapt it to your research field. It's a flexible methodology that you can alter depending on your own needs. Next slide, please. The second indicator is the exposure the content has on users. We will measure this looking at the number of views accumulated on the platforms. We have separated this from the engagement because this can be a more passive indicator. For instance, a video can be automatically played on some platforms and the users are just exposed to it because they follow an account or a channel, or they form part of a group. In this case, we acknowledge that it's impossible to fully assess whether they intentionally decided to play a video or it automatically played. Again, for simplicity, we will take the platform where the hoax is gathering the highest metrics, and 2 points are here up for grabs. Next slide, please. The third indicator we will measure is the cross-platform diffusion, taking into account the number of platforms where the content has circulated. We will allocate 1 extra point if the content has been shared on more than 2 platforms, including messaging chat services such as Telegram or WhatsApp. And after these 3 indicators, we will have a preliminary idea of the possible virality of the hoax. If we continue, we will be able to better understand the outreach. Next slide, please, Leticia. Thank you. Our 4th factor is language. We will look at the number of languages in which the hoax appeared. The single piece of disinformation will score 1 extra point if it circulated in more than 1 language. This factor will be set as an indicator of the spread of content in more than 1 big collective or group. In this way, we will use language as a proxy indicator inspired by Ben Nimmo's concept of communities. But the question is, do the researchers need to understand those sense of languages to assess the indicator? Maybe not. Collaborative efforts between researchers and networks of fact checkers can offer a way around the issue. Next slide, please. A further indicator is the media outreach. The breakout scale also raises the question whether the content reached mainstream media. In our index, a piece of content will also score 1 extra point if it has reached any mainstream outlet, qualified newspapers, TV or radio stations, or if the media outlet is the primary transmitter of the hoax. That's very relevant given their biggest audience and also the expectations to uphold fact-checking standards. We will exclude from this category alternative media or fringe sites, usually with smaller audiences, but we will include big state-sponsored media. And next one, please. The subsequent indicator will be the type of actor who transmits or spreads the content. We will give 1 extra point if the transmitter or amplifier of the disinformative content is an influencer, a politician, an artist, or any public figure. That is an important indicator because it lays in the abuse of popularity of the source. They abuse their public image to make misleading or false narratives credible, and they can reach broader audiences. And they are shaping the public opinion. This category also appears in the scale, but in our index, we have added the category of persistent disinformative transmitter, meaning transmitters who had been fact-checked more than once, a kind of repeated offenders. I'm sure you can think of several examples. And in the case provided in the slide, there is a pseudo-journalist spreading disinformation on her Telegram channel. Fact-checkers have debunked her posts dozens of times, so we consider her a persistent disinformation transmitter, for instance. Next one. We also consider that not just the content matters, but also the media in which it's delivered. And we will give 1 extra point if the same hoax circulated in different formats. For instance, video, pictures, memes, maps, charts. Why? Because the different formats make it possible to reach further audiences and also can imply engagement if people create new formats to spread it. It can also imply an extra effort by the transmitter to make the content circulate. For instance, in the slide, we can see a video and a poster of the same hoax as part of a campaign, falsely claiming that there will be a public transport ticket costing €0. The campaign used other formats, including even false tickets to be printed. And we arrived to another core part of our assessment, that is the call to action. Next one, please. We understand this as an exhortation of any kind, for instance, to organize an offline protest or to harass somebody, to disobey a law or to resist a vaccine. Action goes beyond ideas, and this could be a game changer for the impact risk assessment. Due to its importance, this indicator will have a multiplier effect on the first indicator regarding engagement on social networks. If the hoax includes an exhortation, the researcher will multiply the value of engagement by 1 and add it to the scores. Or what is the same, we will double the value of the engagement. In this way, the risk of the combination of a high engagement as an exhortation to act will be reflected in the index. Of course, if there is no exhortation, the call for action indicator will score 0. In the slide, we can see a false poster calling people to carry Russian books to a library to burn them. That is an example of an explicit call to act. And here we have the final score and the scale. Next slide, please. Applying this point system, the hoaxes can score a maximum of 13 points. From 0 to 10 points, they will classify the hoaxes in low, moderate, or high risk, while from 10 to 13, it will be an alarming impact risk, as you can see below. Next slide, please. And to finalize, I would like to insist on the flexibility of the index. The numbers are tentative and the standards are dynamic. Everyone can adapt them to the specific needs of the research or the size of the community that they are studying. And that's all on my end, Alex. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to listening to my cohort today and to opening the discussion.
Thank you, Raquel. Thank you so much. I'm gonna, before Ben kicks in, I will also encourage you to use the Slido part to ask your questions already. If you want to ask questions to Raquel or to Ben, we're gonna use that platform for this. So feel free to really use it. I'm resharing the code of the Slido and the QR code. Feel free to use it. We had already more than 20 contributions yet. And I see questions coming in. I'm also putting this small question for you, which is also looking at the different criteria that you use to prioritize your fact checks or your investigations. I think that might nurture the conversation afterwards. Ben, the floor is yours. I think you also have very interesting things to share with us on the different steps of the Breakout Scale tool that you developed 2 years ago now. Ben, the floor is yours for 12 to 14 minutes.
That's great. Thank you, Alexandre. And thank you, Raquel. That was really great. And it's great to see that the conversation is evolving here. As the guy said, I developed the Breakout Scale 2 years ago, published it, developed it 2.5 years ago, published it 2 years ago this month. And what I was trying to do was find a working scale that we could use as open source researchers to assess the impact of an influence operation while we were still investigating. So the idea was to look at something in real time with the kind of evidence that you and we all have when we're doing an open source investigation. Next slide, please. So one of the things with the Breakout Scale, and this has come out in the last couple of years of conversation, is it is designed for real-time assessment. So you do the best you can with the evidence that you have. And it's intended to be updated as the situation changes. So if you get an operation where you see it consistently tracking at a 2, and then you see something changing, it is entirely legitimate to say, okay, we're changing where this is on the Breakout Scale. Suddenly we have a breakout. Spamouflage, the Chinese spam network, would be a good example where there was absolutely nothing for years, and then they suddenly started getting breakout after like a couple of years of operation. So if the situation changes, the assessment changes. That's the way the job works, right? It's based on evidence that can be observed through open source research. I designed it for our community. I designed it for us to use, journalists, researchers. The one caveat is that it's focused on assessing individual operations or on comparing operations that we can see. It's not focused on assessing the impact on a whole society of the existence of operations. And again, this is something that was a conversation after the initial publication. Next slide, please. The central concept of the Breakout Scale is breakout. And that's when you see a claim or a piece of content, something that you can attribute to an operation, being picked up and shared in a community or platform where the operation did not post it. If you think about an operation as being an artificial construct and something which creates artificial things, breakout is the moment where you can actually say that is now going organic. And that means that it indicates that the content or claim has been picked up and spread by real people who, as far as we can tell, and remember, this is always based on the evidence that we have to hand at time, it's being spread by real people. And underneath that, you also have the concept of the community, which is a group of people who self-identify as sharing a particular set of values or identity. And contrary to the breakout, if a piece of content stays in the community where it was planted, then it's not getting breakout. So if you get a group of people who passionately support one politician and they share the piece of content in that group, but it never goes beyond that group, it's staying in the community, but it's not getting breakout. Breakout is where it gets picked up and carried somewhere else into a different community. And you can think of it, particularly with the experience of the pandemic, you can think of it as equivalent to a virus. If it's moving into a new host or if it's moving into a new community, that's when it has the chance to spread exponentially. And that's what we're looking for with the breakout scale. Next slide. This is the breakout scale. It's inspired by the scale for using for measuring tropical storms. It runs from 1 to 6. Category 1 is the low end of the scale. They are the least worrying operations. Category 6 are the highest operations. I'll talk through each category in a little bit more detail, but not too much, because you guys know that when I talk in detail, it can go on a long time. All the examples I'm going to give are drawn from public reporting, open source research, stuff that we've worked on together as a community over the years. So again, I designed this for the open source community. So if we go to the next slide, category 1 is when an operation stays on one platform and there's no breakout. So this is the simplest of the simple. An operation puts it in one place and effectively it stays there. On the next slide, we'll see an example of that. This is a meme that was run, again, reported in open source reporting. This was run by an Iranian influence operation way back in 2012. They were experimenting very briefly with the US election, sort of meme targeting into the US election. They were only really on Facebook. They dropped this meme somewhere on platform, posted it, left it there. And as you can see from the bottom of the shot, nobody liked it, nobody commented, nobody shared. This was an operation on one platform, which was going nowhere. And so that's where you can look at it and think, okay, maybe the only people who looked at this were the operators and the researchers. There's no indication here that this has reached any kind of community that the operation would have actually been targeting. Next slide, please. Category 2 is the only category in the scale where you can have two different options. You can think of them as 2A and 2B. Either you have an operation that is only on one platform, but you actually observe breakout within communities on that platform, or you see it on many platforms, but you're not experiencing breakout. In either case, what you're effectively seeing is an operation which is trying to get somewhere, but is in some way limited. If it's only on one platform, then by definition, anybody who is not on that platform will not be exposed to it. If it's on many platforms, but it's not breaking out anywhere, then again, it's a very circumscribed number of people who have the risk of being exposed to it. So either way, category 2 is a limited danger category. And if we go to the next slide, here on the left, we have an example of a category 2, which was the operation that we refer to as IRA copy pasta. So as this was the Russian Internet Research Agency targeting the US in late 2019. As far as we know, they were only on Instagram. But what they were doing on Instagram was running a whole bunch of accounts that posed as members of different communities within the US. There were conservative accounts, there were progressive accounts, there were gun rights accounts, there were LGBTQ accounts. And each of them was getting some breakout in their communities. Some of their posts, many of which were copy-pasted from other people, were actually getting engagement in different communities. But it was only on the one platform. So again, as long as it stays on one platform, anybody not on that platform is not going to see it. If we click again, and we'll see the other image on this screen, hopefully. There we go. Yeah. So this is a graphic, a screenshot or set of screenshots from Spamouflage, the above mentioned Chinese spam network. And this came out mid-2020 when Spamouflage was starting to target the United States. What you have here is that Spammer would drop a video on one platform and then amplify it across Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. using a whole load of fake accounts, many of which had AI generated profile pics because they were very into their GAN generated profile pics at that point. But the only amplification they got was coming from fake accounts. And so if you look at the way it's spreading, yes, it's cross-platform. It's on 3 platforms at the same time. But again, the only people who appear to be engaging with it are fake accounts, so the operators, and then researchers, the folks who are exposing it. So it's in more places, but it's actually not reaching any kind of significant target audience. Next slide. Category 3 operations are where you have, it's still only on social media, but you're getting multiple platforms and you're seeing multiple breakout. Category 3 is a really important category to keep an eye out for, because if you think you found a category 3 operation, normally category 3 is a fairly ephemeral phase. It's kind of like the teenage years. It's not quite grown up yet, but it's getting close and it's changing fast. And if you think you found a category 3 operation, it's really important to expose it as soon as you can, because the more something is spreading across more platforms and into more communities, the higher the risk that it's actually going to make the real breakthrough step, which is moving off social media entirely. And you can think of, this is kind of a mid-stage life cycle of some of the bigger operations. So the original Russian Internet Research Agency that was targeting the US in 2015-16 was spreading across different social media platforms before it then got picked up. If you think about some of the conspiracy theories that have gone around, they have swirled around different communities, different conspiracy groups on different platforms, and then they've gradually bubbled up and then suddenly broken out. So if you find a category 3 operation, it's really important to expose it as soon as you can. Next slide. Category 4 operations are then when we're getting into dangerous territory, because what we're seeing is that operations are leaving social media entirely and they're getting picked up by mainstream media. So they're breaking out of the social medium and into the traditional one. Next slide. My favorite example of this, apologies to the Los Angeles Times, is an LA Times piece from early 2017, which was about the online reaction to Starbucks announcing that it was going to hire 10,000 refugees as part of its response to the refugee crisis. And the LA Times ran a story about what the two sides were saying on Twitter. On the right of the political spectrum, it quoted 2 accounts, Pamela Moore 13 and Tennessee GOP. Both of those were run by the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. And the only tweets that were embedded representing the right-hand side of American politics were those 2. And so in this case, you see the Russian Internet Research Agency has entirely broken out of social media. It's been picked up by a mainstream outlet. It's been lent that mainstream outlet's credibility, and it's entirely supplanted the voice of actual people in the United States. So that's a whole step up from just being on social media. It's broken out all the way. If we go to the next slide. Category 5 is a similar thing. It's something which gets picked up off social media and amplified by somebody with more credibility. But in this case, we're talking celebrity amplification. And when I wrote the Breakout Scale, I defined celebrity widely, which is very flattering to very many people. It can include, obviously, real celebs. It can include musicians, film stars, but also leading politicians, leading commentators, people who have a large and dedicated following, who believe them and who believe in what they say, people who have credibility to lend. Because if somebody who has real credibility picks up a claim from an influence operation and runs with it, effectively they're putting their seal of approval on what the operation has done without knowing it. And so when it hits their audience, it's coming to that audience with all the credibility of the person itself. And you'll see on the next slide, an example of that was in 2019 before the UK general election. We know from open source reporting, we know from the work that a load of us did back then, that Operation Secondary Infection planted online a whole load of documents about US-UK trade talks, which were interpreted as saying that the NHS was up for sale. And those were leaked online, but then the links, again, we know from subsequent reporting and witness testimony, were emailed to various activists, and they ended up coming to the Labour Party, and then Jeremy Corbyn published them. Now, there's no indication at all that he knew what the provenance was, but we did the forensics and pointed to the similarities with secondary infection. But this was during a general election campaign. And so you have the leader of the opposition picking up something that, as far as we could tell at that time, had been posted online by an influence operation. And it changed the tenor of the debate. It changed the focus of the debate in the UK for at least a couple of news cycles. So that was a really big breakout for the operation. Next slide. And then category 6 is the most dangerous category, because again, to Raquel's point, that's going beyond words to actual impact in terms of decision-making or events on the ground. So a category 6 operation is one that triggers some kind of policy response, or there's a credible risk of violence. It's important to nuance that to say we're talking about credible risk of violence here. I remember after the Skripal poisoning, I got a bunch of targeting by pro-Russian Twitter users who were saying, I'm going to come all the way from Vladivostok and kill you. Like, okay, do we think that's really a credible threat? So it's not enough to be issuing a threat, but if there is a credible risk of violence or danger, then it is hitting a category 6. So on the next slide. Classic example. When Debbie Wasserman-Schultz resigned her post at the Democratic National Committee a few months before the 2016 election, because of the influence operation that had hacked and leaked emails led by Russian military intelligence, that is a category 6. Effectively, it's a decapitation of a political organization by an influence operation a few months before an election. That's something where you can say that happened because of this operation, and it's a real political change. On the right-hand side, you have, one of the archetypes of on-the-ground influence. The Internet Research Agency in May 2016 organized 2 conflicting rallies in Houston, Texas, on the same day at the same place. One of them was supporting a Muslim education center, and the other one was opposing it. The IRA organized both at the same time, and we know from witness testimony that the IRA said, hey, bring your weapons if you have them. So if you had been investigating that case, and if you had found those posts before the event, you would be thinking there's a credible risk of violence there. This is an operation which is trying to put people on guns out on the streets facing off against each other. There's a real danger there. Thankfully, there was no violence. But if you'd found it beforehand, you would be looking at that and thinking, that is a category 6. We really need to act on that one. Next slide. Now, as I said at the top, there are different ways to use the breakout scale. If you think you have a fairly short-term and well-contained operation, you can apply it to the whole operation. So, for example, there was a case last year where a shady PR firm called Faze was emailing influencers and trying to get them to push COVID vaccine disinformation. It was fairly well circumscribed in time and location. You could put that as a single case and apply the breakout scale to it. You can also apply the breakout scale to moments of longer term operations. So my favorite Russian operation, secondary infection, ran from early 2014 up until at least 2019. It was almost always stuck in category 2. It would be dropping content on different bits of the internet and then just leaving them to wither there. But it hit a category 5 breakout during the 2019 UK election. So that would be one way you can say, in general, it's category 2, but it has occasional spikes. Using the breakout scale does rely on cross-platform research. You have to go and look in as many places as possible to find it. So if you are focused on a single platform, it'll be much harder to apply it. But importantly, you can use it to compare operations. If you're looking at 2 operations and you're not sure which one to prioritize, you can use the breakout scale to see which one appears to be scoring higher. You can also use it to situate the breakout scale, to situate any operation you're looking at in the historical context. So if you're looking at a new operation and you think, how do I compare this with Russian military intelligence or secondary infection or the Faze case or whatever it might be, you can actually work out where does it sit on the breakout scale. And you can say, okay, actually what I have here is 2 accounts on 1 page with 0 followers only posting in 1 place. Okay, so that's just a category 1. Or you might be saying, wow, this is getting retweeted by the entire political party of country X. you're getting breakout up to category 4 or 5 if it's influencers, 4 if it's media. So you can use it to compare operations. And the final point is that it's also a way to assess vulnerability. And if we look at the next slide, because the thing with the breakout scale is that if you accept the premise that the more an influence operation is breaking out and getting to new groups with greater impact and greater credibility and greater amplification, then that means that the higher it goes up the scale, the more there is a vulnerability that it's exposing. And if you think about where the vulnerabilities are, for a category 4, the vulnerability is that it's media that's doing the amplification. Category 5 is celebrities that are doing the amplification. Category 6 is there's actually a policy response triggered by some piece of content pushed by an operation. And so if you start thinking in that way, then we all need to start thinking, how do we reduce the risk there? What needs to be done in society as a whole, in the open source community as a whole, to reduce the risk that the media will innocently pick up pieces of content seeded by an influence operation and not realize it? Same with celebrities, same with politicians, same with political parties. How do we reduce the risk for all of us? Because operations get really dangerous when they get that really high level exposure. And so something that we can all be talking through is, how do you reduce the risk of that exposure particularly? That is more than enough from me, and I think we are at time. So thank you very much, guys. And I will hand back to Alexandre.
Thank you, Ben. Very fascinating questions already in the chat on this. So I already picked some questions. Again, ask your questions on slido.com. Code is 9593696. Is to test all your micromobility of fingers on your phone or on your computer. So many numbers, and a QR code that you can use also. You can also vote for questions. So questions with more votes, of course, get up. First question for Raquel. Maybe before we open the floor to questions, maybe a question from myself to Ben and Raquel. Do you think the scale and the risk index talk to each other? Do you think like the more you're high on the index risk, the more chance you have to be high on the impact scale, and vice versa into how you analyze it? I don't know if you have a campaign that you are investigating, you see a few hoaxes and you see that all of them are going to very high risk, and you can start to rely them together. It gives you like a better way to evaluate the impact of an overall campaign if you can link the dots together or the narratives together, for instance.
Yes, I think so. So I think both methodologies can complement each other. I think we are basically looking at the same factors. We are looking at the actors, the content, and the amplification, distribution, media outreach, and I think for me, the essential difference lies in the application. The index can be more accurate for hoaxes, while the scale is designed for influence operations. But I think the index can also help to detect an influence operation that is behind it. For instance, I can imagine that we start with a hoax, we pull the thread, and then we see that it unravels from something bigger. And then we can start to go deeper and detect an influence operations. And once the influence operation is detected, the scale is a more viable method to assess its impact. So I think in some way, the index can be used to anticipate an influence operation. I don't know if you agree, Ben.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a really good dialogue that happens between the two scales, and partly it's a two-way dialogue because you can approach it from either direction. If you're primarily looking at pieces of content, then if you use the risk index to work out which is the most risky piece of content here, that gives you a place to start as an investigator to then think, okay, how am I going to look at this? Is there something more behind it? Is it, does it look like it's just innocent users who are pushing this? Or do you look at them and think, hang on, that's an AI generated profile picture, and so is that one and that one and that one, and actually what I've got is a whole network of fake accounts. And then I see, oh, hang on, they're pushing out a particular domain here, and all the editors on the domain have GAN faces. And you realize that you've pivoted from a single piece of content to an operation. But it can also go the other way around as well. Let's say the first thing you spot is the fake account with the AI generated profile picture. And you look at it and think, okay, well, just one account. But then you look at what it's posting, and you see that the stuff that it's posting is starting to get pick up and breakout and engagement and a call to action. And you think, okay, so that's actually a significant hoax. And then you start thinking, well, what's the most urgent thing to do right now? If one particular piece of content is going out there, or you think is risking going out there, then you probably want to prioritize working out how big is the piece of content, what do we need to do about the content? If you think, and then you can look at the operation once you've dealt with the immediate problem. If you think that it's not really going anywhere yet, then you have more time to investigate the operation itself. And so you can come at this from both directions, but you can marry up the two scales, and ultimately, you know, there's a genealogy here, right? The scales are related to each other. So whichever one you're on tells you that likely if you flip to the other side, you're probably going to be quite high up that scale as well. So either way you approach it, it's a really good way to give you warning. This thing that I'm looking at is something which I need to be looking at more.
Great, thank you. I think it's interesting leads for future work. First question, Raquel, how do you track a single hoax across media, platforms, languages?
I'm not sure that I am the right person to answer this question, because I'm not a fact checker, and that's mainly a primarily task of fact checkers. We at EU DisinfoLab, we monitor the debunks that the fact checkers have already done, meaning we are not deciding. But yeah, maybe some fact checker of the audience can jump in and give some. Ben, I mean, will jump in.
Yeah, I mean, if it helps, I mean, I'm not a fact checker, but actually, if you think of Operation Secondary Infection, that was, in a sense, that was a whole series of hoaxes. Because what secondary infection would do would be, it would create, most of the time it would create a forged document of some kind. You know, it's a fake letter from one politician to another, or it's a Photoshop screenshot of somebody doing a tweet, and then it'll drop it in different places across the internet. And so one of the things you can do, let's say it's a Photoshopped tweet, then you reverse search it and you see where else it's showing up. And once you recognize the behavior pattern of secondary infection, you can quickly start saying, okay, where is this thing going? And if the image is the same, then one of the things you look at is how many different languages is this popping up in. Something else that happened with secondary infection a lot was it was regularly working in 6 or 7 different languages. And so, and some of the keywords it was using were pretty unique. And so it was laborious and it was manual work. But one of the things we did, we actually manually translated secondary infection story keywords into different languages and went and searched for them. And it took time, and we started doing that once we realized this was regularly working in 6 different languages. So it took a while to get there. But again, that creative approach of keyword searching helped as well. So there are tools that you can use, like reverse search and just targeted translation, if you suspect that it might be popping up in particular languages. But it helps then to know which target languages you're thinking of, right? We knew that secondary infection always worked in the same 6 or 7 languages. Maybe they were operating in Mandarin as well. I've no clue. We hadn't found it, so we didn't start doing that translation work. So there's a certain amount of limitation there. But yeah, I mean, particularly if you're dealing with images, then reverse search is going to be your best friend.
Yeah.
If I may, what we do when a fact checker has detected hoax, what we do is searching for this narrative or this picture of this video in different platforms we are investigating. And then the same with the language. We translate, or we ask for any fact checker if they have heard of this hoax in their countries. So it's more a collaborative effort between us, the researchers at the EU DisinfoLab. And this way we are tracking the hoaxes amplification.
Thank you, both of you. The always tricky question about the intentions, beyond the malicious actors, would it be interesting to add an estimate of the intentionality into the assessment? How to measure intent of malicious actors? That's always a tricky question for many investigators. Who wants to take this one?
Wow. That makes the difference between mis and disinformation, and that's a very, very sensitive issue also for us investigating a false piece of content, because sometimes even if an actor doesn't want to harm anyone, because there are really transmitters of misinformation that spread hoaxes because they really think they are truths. So this is something very, very subjective that we cannot evaluate or assess in a good way. So we decided to focus on the harm that this content can cause.
I think that's a good answer, Raquel. Intention is always very complicated to assess, and it's better to look at the risk of public harm for this kind of stuff. I just want to say to Anonymous, I've seen the question of GIFCT. I would just want to commit at the end because I think that's more opening the question to other stuff. So I will keep it for the end. Don't worry, Mr. or Miss Anonymous. Context or timing factor. I think you talked about it, Ben, a bit around election time and like how the breakout can be timely and have more consequences and can like have more impact. Do you want to elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And there are times and places where you would be more concerned about seeing an operation in any given category. But the way I would think of that would be more that it's a subsidiary consideration which you would use, all other things being equal. So if you have an operation that is, let's say you have an operation that is category 1 in a country which is about to have an operation, have an election, and you have a category 6 in a country which is not, it would be hard to argue that you should prioritize the category 1 over the category 6 because of all the other factors that are going on. If you have 2 category 3s or 4s at the same time, and one is in a conflict zone or has an election coming up and the other doesn't, that for me, that would be when that calculation kicks in and you say, okay, this is the one that we really need to focus on. So I think for me, the context and timing in that sense would be a tiebreaker more than an absolute on its own. The one other thing I would think though is that, you know, by the nature of all of our jobs and particularly on the open source side, I would expect to see whenever you're doing the planning of what are we going to look for next, we all have in our own minds, okay, here are the sensitive points that are coming up where we would expect to see, or we would be more worried about seeing some kind of influence operation. So I think the other time and the other circumstances where context and timing would really factor in would actually be in the planning. You know, if you're getting together and thinking, right, what are we actually going to go and investigate next? Where do we start? Then a lot of us would kick off with, let's think about open source leads around an election or a conflict. And so I think the other part of it is that factors into, I mean, certainly all through my open source career, it has factored into where you actually start looking next.
Thank you.
I remember we had this discussion about the context when we designed the index, and we just decided to leave it out for simplicity. But in our reports, I have to say, we always take in account the events in which each hoax is framed. So every time we report about the disinformative trends of the month, we are always considering this, but we do it once we have applied the index. So we take in account the context as an external factor.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to you, Raquel. First indicator of the, I think it's from the risk scale engagement. How do you take into account bots or AI generated fake likes, etc., compared to real users? Good one.
Yeah, we are not taking this in account at all, because at first sight is not always evident that. So if we see some very suspicious behavior, and we see that it's not normal or not usual that this piece of content has 1 million of likes, it was posted yesterday, then we have a look. But if not, there is no time. We are using it just for simplicity, for having a first idea of the risk of the hoax, and then if we want to research and go deeper, then we can have a deeper look. But we are not taking this in account in the first application of the index, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
And sorry, Alex, that's one thing where you might see that flip between the index and then the breakout scale, because the breakout scale with the concept of the community, that is one of the things we would look at. Is it breaking out of a single community? And for example, again, I mean, Spamouflage is a really good example of this because it looks very cross-platform, right? And you'll often find a cluster of Spamouflage activity which has 25 or 30 likes and comments and shares on every platform you're looking at. But when you actually dig in a bit, when you start thinking, all right, what is the community that is spreading in? You look at it and think, oh, okay, they're all fakes and they're all run by the operation and they're all just sort of standing in a circle shouting at each other. And so that's one of the uses of that community approach is it forces you to look at how the amplification is happening. And that's normally a good time to say, if you see the obvious fakes, you can weed them out. Now, if the fakes are really good, you're not going to spot that. And that's one of the things with the breakout scale, as I said, you adjust it as you go based on the evidence you have. So if you realize that, oh, wow, actually, I thought this was getting really big breakout because it's getting 1,000 likes on each one, but they're all fake, then you readjust what your rating is on the scale.
Yeah, we only have like 4 minutes left. So very quickly, should the threat actor factor get into the measurement? So trying to know what is the threat actor can modify your score. I guess that's the question. The
threat actor, meaning the type of transmitter.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it can modify it, but we have given this just 1 point in our index because yeah, we think the public figure can play a very, very important role in the amplification of the content and also in making the content more credible and shaping the public opinion. But it's just one step more in the scale or in the index. And also we have added this important category of the persistent disinformer or persistent repeated offender, because we encounter very often this kind of people or accounts that posted once and again false information and nobody stops them. And yeah, we think they are reaching broader audiences because if they are doing this, it's because they have an audience for this. And that's the reason why we consider they are also threat actors at the same level or at a similar level than the other ones, the public figures. I don't know if I am answering your question.
For Ben, talking about vulnerabilities, you mentioned at the end of your presentation, is media and information literacy crucial into educate about the risk and the vulnerabilities that we have?
I mean, so my personal opinion is that anything we can do helps, and there are lots of different things you can do. It can be as simple as teaching someone to reverse search an image or teaching them to recognize an AI-generated profile picture. But the point of influence operations is that they are trying to influence people, right? They are trying to reach people, and you need to think about the target audience, the way they're working, and how do you reduce the vulnerabilities across the scale? How much is a is a question of media and information literacy for the broad population, that's always going to be useful. How much is awareness and defensive thinking if you're actually talking with influencers, for example? Would it be really useful if more influencers knew how to spot influence operations, knew how to spot fake accounts? Yes, it probably would, because then they're reducing the risk of themselves. And so I'm all in favor of teaching more people how to recognize this stuff in any way that it can be done. But I think an interesting conversation would be to have around, are there particular vulnerable categories of people who would have a particularly severe impact if they amplified some kind of influence operation? And is there some way that you can actually work with them?
Thank you. Last question, and we'll close the webinar. I think that's the question about, like, would it be relevant to establish a similar mechanism to counter high-risk disinformation as we have about terrorism with GIFCT, which is a global internet forum against counterterrorism? I think that's a question of, like, sharing ways, methods, scales, index, any kind of common measurement between civil society, industry, and other practitioners. Do you think there would be some kind of interesting cooperation there, or have some kind of workflow that could also be established between all of these actors, which is another question. Trying to merge this, and we'll close on this one. Good luck.
Wow. I think the index, we can open the door to apply the index to other fields. And yeah, the fight against terrorism can be one, why not? I think we could use the indicators as factors, and doing this, we can work on the scenarios designed, and design the baseline scenario describing the initial situation, and starting from this, we can maybe anticipate the most likely future scenario, or design the worst case scenario. And we can apply this to hoaxes, influence operation, or whatever field, just to try to anticipate their impact. Why not in terrorism?
Ben?
Yeah, indeed. The one thing I'd add is that the more we can share information about the threats, across industry, across society, the more it can be exposed, the better. But there always needs to be that caveat of what exactly are we talking about and what exactly are we sharing? Would we be talking about an individual piece of content? Would we be talking about, let's say, an entire operation? Would we be talking about something in between? Because it's the kind of thing where you need to make sure that, frankly, that the boundaries of speech are protected, and you need to make sure that the conversation should be around: are we talking about individual pieces of content here, or are we talking about whole behavioral networks? Because there's a very different kind of dynamic about what gets shared and how. So in general, sharing information about threats always helps, but there would need to be a lot of conversations around exactly what the guardrails are and what the guidelines are on how, what goes in and also what gets left out.
That's what in French we say, réponse de Normand. The French people will get it, and the people speaking French also. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Raquel. This webinar will be available on replay on YouTube. Last poll for the people that want to also help us to understand, will you use the scales in your work? Yes, for sure. It's not really applicable to my work, or I'm considering it. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, both of you, for your time and expertise today. And see you very soon for another EU DisinfoLab webinar. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.